Yo, fourth graders. Going to use my globe to show you the areas of the world I've been talking about during expedition. Here is Spain, France, Italy, and England. In the last lesson, I talked about how explorers took ships across the North Atlantic Ocean, not entirely sure that they might not be sailing right off the edge of the world. But they did not. They came to what we now know of as North America, first here, and then eventually colonizing the entire continent. There's Arizona. Christopher Columbus was one of the first that came to this new world. He thought he was in India. So he called the people that he came across when he first came to the New World Indians. But that is where India is, actually. Another Italian navigator found his way to the New World, and he named it after himself. His name was Amerigo Vespucci, and this new continent he called America after Amerigo. So I know it seems a little strange. I mean, a person names a continent that's been there for eons after himself, but we could have done much worse. I mean, he could have opted to use his last name, in which case we would be living in Vespuccia or Vespucci land. We would be Vespucci landers. But I'm getting ready for our second lesson, expedition of the exploration and colonization of North America by the Europeans. I will go set up and be back in a flash. Okay, hi. I hope I'm in the frame. Hello. We are moving into the 1600s now, and European exploration has changed. It's become colonization. The difference between exploration and colonization is very different. It's important because exploration is exploring the New World and learning about its people and learning about its land. But the Europeans began their colonization, which means that they settled the New World and took over the land and started exerting power over the Native American people that were there when they got there. So the Native Americans that lived in North America, this European colonization changed everything. I mean, even before they started settling the land and taking over, just the goods that Europeans brought over in the 1500s, starting with glass beads and copper kettles and metal utensils, that started to change the way of life for the Native Americans. They used the copper kettles they would cut up and make jewelry out of, or use them as weapons, which they had never done before. So pretty much everything changed. Although the Native Americans tried to hold on to their way of life during all this, it became increasingly difficult once the Europeans started introducing these goods into their lives, these items that they brought over from Europe. And as these European goods became more and more common, they became part of the Native Americans' daily lives. Some Native Americans stopped wearing the animal hides that they traditionally wore and started wearing European textiles or cloth. They stopped using their clay pots that they would make and started using metal pots and pans. And the flint and steel that they would trade for made it a lot easier to start fires. Also, these traditional shell beads that Native Americans would make, or as you guys know from a previous expedition, wampum, they were able to make them much faster, and there was actually an astonishing increase in the creation of wampum, which, as you know, was used as jewelry in ceremonies and also as currency or money. Native North Americans began adapting European brassware, using it to make arrowheads and pots and pans turned into knives, and even the axes that they would cut their firewood with, they realized could be used as weapons. But one of the biggest changes that happened were when the Europeans introduced muskets, these long-barreled, lightweight guns. The Native Americans realized that these weapons made battle much more deadly, much more lethal, and less dominant nations that had been having trouble with larger nations began trading for these muskets and using them to fight their enemies. Now, when I did my research, I came across a nation that you have learned about in a previous expedition, the Haudenosaunee. As they were trying to bring peace and join nations together, their traditional rivals, the Anishinaabeg, traded for muskets and tried to resist this. They did not prevail, but it shows you how the warfare changed, and the muskets were a big part of that. So originally they used the muskets to fight each other, but of course as more and more colonization happened, the Native Americans actually started using these muskets against the Europeans that had brought them here in the first place. Now, it didn't just change their warfare, also it changed the way they practiced their harvesting of beaver. It moved it into more of a commercializing event. They would use these beaver pelts to trade for items that they needed from Europe, and they started using, as I said, more and more in their daily lives and becoming dependent upon. The tradition of hunting for food became less and less important as Native Americans started hunting for hides to trade. And colonization didn't only affect the people and how they traded, it actually affected the land itself in North America. As I said, the beaver became very important. It was super popular in Europe. The Europeans were making these hats out of these beaver pelts. And as beaver became more of a commodity to trade, the Native Americans began over-hunting, making them super scarce in the northeastern part of the continent, which also led to fewer beaver ponds and fewer fish, and it affected the moose and the deer of the area. Now, the deer was something Native Americans traditionally hunted, and it became scarcer and scarcer as the Europeans brought over pigs, and pigs were allowed to forage through the forest and eat all the food that the deer had been eating before that, so they became an invasive species. Now, these are a lot of big changes. My next lesson is going to be how the industries and occupations and resources changed North America during colonization, but before I do, I need to talk about a drastic change that happened during that time as well, and that is slavery. Now, slavery has been going on forever and ever, actually since before the written word. We don't know. As long as people have been writing down history, slavery has been a part of this world. But it was different for different parts of the world. In North America, before the European settlers even came over, Native Americans were keeping slaves after battle. They would battle with other nations, they would capture people, bring them over, and make them into slaves, which could look differently depending on the nation. Some people might be slaves for life, some captured people might be slaves for life, they might be killed, or they might just be adopted into the community and live there as one of them. Usually they were not traded, but if they were, usually they would trade people that the Native Americans would trade people they had caught in battle for people they had lost in battle. And every once in a while, if an individual owed a debt, or maybe they needed something for their family they just couldn't afford, they would offer themselves into slavery. But until this great expansion and colonization by the Europeans, that's pretty much how it went. Now, once the colonization happened, there was a need for labor. They needed people to clear land and build houses and put up fences. And because, as I said before in the lesson before, a lot of the Native Americans were dying from their lack of immunity to European diseases, there were fewer and fewer of them to use in this labor. And the Europeans began trading Native American nations for these slaves that they had captured in battle and taking those people to do this work. At that point, they started actually buying and selling these people, which changed things a lot as well. So, moving on in history, like I said, the Native American labor was becoming less and less an option for Europeans. So they changed their ways and began racializing slavery, meaning that they went over to another continent, brought millions of people over, choosing those people on the basis of the color of their skin, and that changed the development of North America. It brought on this vast slave plantation complex. I'm going to talk a little bit later about that in lesson 3 of our expedition, but I can tell you that racializing of the slave trade is affecting people today in North America still. So, signing off, Miss Denise for Miss Barbara's 4th grade expedition. All right, we wish you well.